President Biden's loan forgiveness plan is unconstitutional, thanks to a new ruling from the U.S. Supreme Court.
Investing in yourself by going to college is actually pretty financially risky. And so that's the problem that we need policy solutions for.
On this episode, we explore why the Biden plan ran afoul of the Constitution, why mass loan forgiveness plans are really the wrong approach. And we're going to equip you with an understanding of a much better way to address student loan debt and the cost of college. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast from Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism by equipping listeners to become more effective champions of sound policy and good principles. Thank you for joining us on Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nick Dunn. We sit down first with Bill Duncan. Bill is the Religious Freedom Policy Fellow here at Sutherland Institute. He's also our resident expert on all things related to the U.S. Supreme Court. Bill, thank you for joining us on Defending Ideas.
Thanks for having me.
I want to jump into big news with the U.S. Supreme Court overturning President Biden's student loan forgiveness plan. And I want to ask you first, what were the legal and constitutional questions at play? Help us understand, how did this get to the court in the first place? And what was the core thing the court was trying to evaluate that led to the decision to overturn the plan?
Well, I think the thing that's most important to keep in mind, and this affects everything that we understand about the decision, is that the core constitutional principle involved is the separation of powers. Whether or not Congress has authority to make the laws, or whether the administrative agencies can change laws they don't like that Congress has made, that's really the underlying question. Now, the specifics of the case involve a law passed in 2001 that gave the Secretary of Education some authority to modify the specific terms in the law, or modify or waive certain requirements. And think about the context of that. This is 2001, so it's right after September 11th. You have people maybe going to school, but they decide, and we certainly are so grateful for people who did, they're going to leave school or they're going to leave their employment so that they can go and serve in the military or, serve the public in some way or other. And we wanted to make sure that they didn't suffer financially as a result of those choices. And so the Congress passed a law, the HEROES Act, that gave the Secretary of Education some ability to make those waivers or modifications so that maybe some administrative ways of meeting their obligations could be met more easily, whatever, to make it easier on them. Because the COVID pandemic was treated by the government as a national emergency, they invoked that same principle to, modify the terms of loan repayment by saying, well, you have a little more time to repay or something like that. It's interesting enough, right after the President Biden said that the pandemic was over, so that in theory the national emergency is over, he also directed the Department of Education to come up with some more waivers and modifications, again, using the language in the statute. But these waivers and modifications looked a lot different than anything that had ever been done by the Department of Education regards to this law before. And in fact said, okay, well, actually, you don't have to pay your student loans at all, right? They're forgiven if you're in a certain category of relatively wealthy compared to others, category of people who owed debt for their student loans. So the question was, does the Secretary of Education have that authority? And a number of states and some private individuals said, no, we don't. The government doesn't have the authority to change essentially the law that Congress passed to do something entirely different than what was intended when Congress initially passed the law, and not just what was intended, but what the law actually said.
I want to pinpoint something you're talking about. So with the HEROES Act, speaking as a non-lawyer, so it seems that even just common sense would suggest it's a stretch, because the HEROES Act, right after those events of September 11th, it's the height of the war on terror, it seems pretty clear that was intended for individuals going overseas to serve in the military. Let's make sure they don't default on student loans while they're serving our country. That seems to be totally different from this circumstance on what seems like a flimsy emergency now. We're far enough past COVID. As you mentioned, President Biden, they're ending the emergency in other areas, but saying it's extended here. So it seems like even a common sense review of it would say that the legal authority in the case they're making seemed weak, Did that kind of filter into the court's decision? Did they essentially articulate that in the law?
In a sense, they did. One thing that's sort of important, and I hope I don't go in the weeds a little bit, but the intent of Congress is not the core thing. I mean, Congress may have intended to do something, but written a law that's, unclear and gives the agencies more power than did. What was really important here is the specific language the court used. And that's really important because in our system, if you're really going to have an effective separation of powers, you have to hold people to the language of the law. And but you're right. In a sense, that does come in because as the Supreme Court's looking at the language of the HEROES Act to decide, is what the Secretary of Education is doing here, does that really count under the law? The answer is clearly no, because the terms modify and waive don't mean cancel, right? Those things just don't mean the same thing. And if the Secretary of Education wanted to do something more less expansive, they had the power to do that under the law, but they wanted to go further, probably responding to constituencies that said, well, this is a great time to do away with student loans, and we think that's a good policy. But it's not up to the administration, to the executive agencies to determine what good policy is. Congress has already established that. They have to live, they have to stay within the lanes that have been established by Congress already.
I want to dive more into that principle of we have to set aside the policy discussion. We're actually going to get into that in a little more depth later in this program. But talking about the role of the court versus the role of Congress versus the role of the presidency. Before we do that, though, can you just give us a quick definition of standing versus merit? Because that's something that's coming up a lot. Folks may think, well, I don't know what that means. Right. Help our listeners understand what those definitions are and why that was relevant in this case.
Yeah, and most lawyers wouldn't be able to answer that question either. So, and I'm not sure that I'll do a good job, but I'll try. The basic, one of the important guarantees in our Constitution is the Supreme Court doesn't just issue opinions on what it thinks is a good idea and what should be the law and what it shouldn't be. The Supreme Court also is limited. It's only allowed to hear cases where someone is directly affected by a policy or a law. And they can't just, you can't just have anybody come into court and say, gosh, I don't like what Congress has done. Strike that down, Supreme Court. They don't have that authority. What we've referred to as standing is essentially the authority of a person to bring a lawsuit. How do they get that authority? Because they have to be directly affected by the law. There were some private people who did not qualify for the loan forgiveness, and they sued and challenged the law. And the Supreme Court today said, sorry, you don't have standing. You don't have the authority to bring this because you're not directly affected by the decision. Now, on the other hand, these states, at least one of the states did have standing, the court held, because they created a nonprofit that administers the loan repayment, the loan program. And they would stand to lose, thousands of dollars, which of course would accrue to the taxpayers of Missouri in this case. And that's why they had standing. They were affected by the decision. So
essentially standing was made a big deal, but there were folks who did have standing. That's why the court ruled on it.
Right.
The court ruling against the administration. Just your quick answer, did the court get it right?
Definitely. The court got it right. The executive agencies do not have the authority to rewrite a statute that's created by Congress. They can only implement it faithfully, and that's their responsibility in our system. If that breaks down, the president has power to do anything, and we don't want that in other settings. This is a good place for the court to have drawn the line.
I think it's worth really emphasizing this point because as you see these issues discussed, in my estimation, far too often media coverage of this and public discussion around this is the policy impact good or bad? Right. That should be irrelevant to what the Supreme Court does. That their job is to evaluate the constitutionality and the legality of it. So to kind of back up and reinforce with our listeners, we have to first set aside whether we like a particular policy outcome and ask that first question of, is this constitutional? Did the president have the authority to do this? And if the answer is no, then nothing else matters unless you're willing to go through Congress. Right. And so can you talk about a little bit how you've mentioned it, but that separation of powers idea, that in many ways this case is as much about our constitutional system as it is specifically about, am I going to get my student loan forgiven? Right. That's ancillary to the core question of who has the authority to do what. Help reinforce for us what the court said of, no, these are the respective roles of the different branches of government, and why is it good to reinforce that, especially for someone who might think, well, I like loan forgiveness. How can we accomplish it? how do we convince that person this was the wrong approach? If you want to fix college loan debt and the cost of college for students, go through Congress. There are other ways that we're going to get into in our next couple segments, but help us just stay grounded in that separation of powers principle.
Well, I think in some ways it's good to look at the positive in a case like this. The positive is the Supreme Court did exactly what the Constitution tasks them with doing, which is to preserve the integrity of the system by ensuring that we all follow the same basic rules. One thing that's sometimes tricky is that, when we like a decision, and particularly we hear a lot of media coverage, the Supreme Court did this, the Supreme Court did that, and the criticisms of the court are based on the policy decision. But the Supreme Court doesn't really, to a great degree, I think they do a great job of trying to put away those considerations and stick with what they're actually asked to do, which is to say, is the law being followed? If that happens, then there's integrity in the system, and we can trust. You can easily imagine a scenario that could go the other way, where a different president says, well, we ought to increase the student loan debt, or we ought to increase the interest paid by these people because we don't like what they're doing. If the Congress doesn't give us the authority to do that, we really should never do it. And that's where the Supreme Court is exactly what they're supposed to be doing. So they're playing the role they should in our system, and we ought to be grateful.
Bill Duncan, defending the constitutional order here at Sutherland Institute. Thanks so much for joining us on Defending Ideas, Bill.
Thanks so much.
We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, sit down with Beth Akers from the American Enterprise Institute to dive into more of the policy implications and some ways to actually fix this issue moving forward. You're listening to Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sutherland Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sutherland provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. On this podcast, we're committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism. Today, we're talking about the student loan issue, and we sit down with another expert to dive into the policy around it. But first, I want to mention, if you like what you're hearing today, please visit defendingideas.org. You can subscribe to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, Google, any of the podcast providers that you like. You can also find clips you can share and links to more information about what we're talking about today. That's defendingideas.org. We're joined now by Beth Akers. Beth is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where she researches higher education, student loans, and workforce development. Beth, thanks so much for joining us today on Defending Ideas.
Thank you for having me.
I want to kind of get your just quick initial reaction to the court's decision. We're going to get into the policy and the economics, but did they get it right?
Well, the court is about the legal decision, and Bill answered that one for you in pretty good detail. What I will say is that I am happy with the outcome because I think the policy in question here was not a good one. I'm very much opposed to what the president was trying to do in terms of broad-based student debt cancellation.
So let's dive into that. Why, thinking back to the administration's rationale for forgiving student loan debt, can you give us a quick refresher on here's what the administration was saying, here's what the level of need was that prompted them to do this in the first place, but then why do you think that's the wrong approach?
Well, we've had a growing concern about the issue of student debt for a couple of decades now. And in fact, even if you look way back, we were complaining about this, 40 years ago as being a crisis or a bubble that was about to burst. But we seemed to hit a point where policymakers seemed so concerned about the issue of borrowers holding unaffordable student debt that they were compelled to act. Now, on the political side of things, I think what really happened is that Democrats found that there was a part of their constituency that would be directly affected by this policy and were motivated to try to affect them in a positive way. I think that's a cynical point of view, but I think that's really part of what's happened here. But I mean, if you step back to what they're actually talking about and saying, the idea is that there are people who have gone to college, they've taken out debts that are unaffordable based on how much they're earning, and they can't afford to pay it back. People are saying things like, young people can't buy houses, young people can't start families, they can't start businesses. And that's true for some people. But it's important to remember the bigger picture facts here, which is that on average, people who are borrowing and paying for college are actually coming out farther ahead than if they hadn't gone to college and borrowed in the first place.
That's one of the things I wanted to ask you about, is because the narrative seems to be, these folks with student loan debt, that they are all just struggling, and so they need help. Isn't it true that most borrowers are meeting their payments? For the vast majority of folks, it is not this crushing burden that you would think it is from the administration. So is this, are we even targeting a group of people who kind of meets this definition of the administration, that they just need help, they've gotten the short end of the stick? Or is it that, most of these folks are actually doing okay, there probably are some problem spots, but for the most part, this demographic is maybe not in desperate need of financial help?
This is a much more accurate characterization than the one that we're often hearing in the popular media or from our lawmakers, specifically Democratic lawmakers. So what we know is that investments in education pay off. They pay off with huge dividends. Estimates indicate that a bachelor's degree will get you an extra $1 million in earnings over the course of your lifetime. And we know that the typical undergraduate leaves their program with about $30,000 in debt. That's a pretty decent proposition when it comes to making an investment in yourself. So we know that most people who go in, start school, finish, have really not a lot of problems paying back their debt. Estimates indicate that people were spending, before the student loan repayment went on pause, they were spending about 4% of their monthly income to repay their student debt. So a pretty modest amount of their take-home pay was going towards paying back what turned out to be a great investment. And then the really high balances that we often hear about and, are made to believe are problematic are most often held by people with professional and graduate degrees, who tend also to be high earners. So there's this correlation between how much debt you have and your earnings potential, which basically says if you're looking out there and looking at debt as an indicator of hardship, you're looking in the wrong direction. We need to be much more nuanced than that.
It strikes me that with this issue, that there really are kind of three key questions to ask. The first one being, is it constitutional, which we talked through with Bill? But then the second and third questions being, number two, is this targeting the right problem? And so can you fill us in on, number one, we kind of talked about this isn't really the right problem to address, but it seems to me that the context around this is college is expensive. It's been getting more expensive. Would this kind of loan forgiveness plan even do anything to reduce the cost of college?
The problem is this would be a boon for people who benefit from it. But what happens to the cohort of students who start college next year? They're now attending colleges that are probably even more expensive because the colleges are thinking, my students will never pay back these loans anyway that they're taking out. And then those students, they have to wait for another president to decide that we should cancel debt, or a future Congress to decide we should cancel debt. So that the notion of a one-time solution doesn't make any sense. We definitely need more of a systemic reform, something that changes the incentives going forward for everybody so that we're not building back into the same position that we're in today.
So it sounds like essentially if left to go forward, we'd essentially be on a treadmill, so to speak. If we did this now, 5 or 10 years from now, we're going to be in the same boat. And in fact, college will probably be more expensive then. So there will be more calls for mass loan forgiveness.
Yeah.
And so to your point, there has to be something else we do moving forward to actually address the cost curve of college. This doesn't do that. But what it does do is create that perverse incentive. Is that for people going to school now, in the future, if it's kind of this idea, I just need to wait around until the government forgives my student loan debt. How much of a risk would you see something like that happening if this plan were allowed to go into effect?
I mean, I think it's huge. If there was a good chance that the government was going to forgive my car loan in 5 years, I'd probably buy a much nicer car. And I think the same thing is going to happen in this space. Now, I mean, people are cautious sometimes, and some are more risk averse than others. So not everybody is going to go out and borrow recklessly, but on the margins, this is going to drive up the cost of college. And just as you said, this is like a treadmill. We get right back to where we started. I think some of the estimates say that we'll be back to this same level of outstanding debt in about 5 years. And that's not even taking into account the idea that some people will borrow more or that colleges will raise prices in response to this new policy.
So I want to ask you that this didn't happen in a vacuum. It's not like there have been no attempts in the past to address college loan debt or student debt forgiveness, and this was the one that was going to make a difference, and then the court struck it down. There are a whole range of programs designed to help people pay back their loans. Can you give us the landscape of those? And maybe that's a better place to focus than a new mass loan forgiveness program.
Yeah. So it's helpful to say, back when I went to college in the dark ages, the student loan that I took on, there really was no getting out from under it. That was kind of the design. This is just a consumer loan and you have to pay it back. But over the past 10 or 15 years, we've kind of had a change of heart in that idea. And this is on both sides of the aisle to say, we don't necessarily want people to be struggling under unaffordable student debts for the rest of their lives. And if our economy and our system of politics is going to rely on this notion that people can pull themselves up by their bootstraps and education is a main way of doing it, it's got to work and it can't be so risky. And so there were programs put in place piece by piece, incrementally, such that now every borrower who takes out a loan through the federal student loan program is eligible to make reduced payments in months when their earnings are low. And if their loan proves to be unaffordable in the long run, they are eligible to have it forgiven. So it's sort of a rat's nest of programs that work together. It's not how I would have crafted it or anyone really, but it's there. And millions of borrowers are getting forgiveness through these programs. This is before we even get to this conversation about mass cancellation. And you never hear about it in those conversations because it's really politically inconvenient to be arguing that we need broad-based relief for borrowers and at the same time acknowledge, oh yeah, we already do have a means-tested version of this program, but we want more.
I want to get into that level of detail of what should we be doing. You have to take a break in a minute, but before we go, I want to kind of try and frame this, that it seems to me that the core issue is really one of two things. Number one, college is too expensive, or number two, people who take out debt are having a hard time paying for it. And if we've already kind of identified that the second group, there is not that level of sort of financial burden that maybe the administration implies there is. And so if the real issue is the cost of college to begin with, because as you've articulated, if you get a degree, you typically will be better off financially than folks who didn't. And so I want to dive into, when we come back, this idea of the cost of college itself, help kind of frame that a little bit, and then tie that into what should we be doing, and obviously these things going through Congress. Because this is an example where the administration tried something and the court struck it down. And these kind of policy debates are best happened where it can be vetted and thoughtfully moved forward through the congressional process. So I just want to really briefly get your take on, if we frame it as either college is too expensive or it's too hard to pay it back, is that the right framing? And then that can guide us to where we need to go for solutions.
Well, I think generally, but I'll kind of narrow it down a bit more. And people think I'm a little bit too dismissive of concerns over price. But if you think about what it costs to go to an elite institution, like $75,000 a year, I would argue that for some of them, that's probably still a pretty good deal. So I don't want to be saying you can't charge these outrageous quote unquote prices because a lot of times it's still worth it. So what bothers me more is that investing in yourself by going to college is actually pretty financially risky. And so that's the solution, or that's the problem that we need policy solutions for.
Well, we're going to have more on this in a few minutes. We're going to take a quick break. We've been talking with Beth Akers from AEI about the loan forgiveness plan that the Supreme Court just struck down from the Biden administration. You're listening to Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nick Dunn. We've been talking with Beth Akers from the American Enterprise Institute about the Biden loan forgiveness plan that was just overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court. Beth, I want to ask you about something the president said, where essentially saying he's not done. That even though the court ruled this way, he still wants to advance this. Other of his supporters want to. Tell us about what he said and whether or not that should be concerning for those of us who agreed with this court decision as protecting the separation of powers.
Right. So this is what we were all waiting for. I mean, I think most people were anticipating the decision from the court, which was to put a stop to Biden's plan. The question was, where is the administration going to go next? And I wasn't sure. I mean, the optimistic thing would be to say maybe they're going to come to the table with Republicans and think about real legislative solutions. In practice, what seems to be happening is it seems that the president is committed to giving the same policy another shot through a different legal authority. So that's concerning, of course, and kind of puts us back into a loop of having to wait and see if things get hung up in the court. So not a lot of progress with that.
So what does this mean for the bigger issue? I mean, we talked before a little bit about if one of the core issues is the cost of college and what should we be doing either to address the cost curve or to help make it more affordable? Just walk us through what is the real problem when it comes to higher education and its cost. And let's start there, and then maybe we can pivot into some potential solutions.
I like to reference this line that Pete Buttigieg used in the Democratic primary debate several years ago, or a handful of years ago now, where he was asked this question. He said, how do we stop the cost of college from going out of control? And how are you as president going to respond to the problem and crisis of college affordability? And he said, I think we need to make it affordable to not go to college. And I thought that was a fantastic way of framing the issue. There's all sorts of theories as to why college is getting more and more expensive every year. There was a period of time where everybody was blaming the fact that colleges had lazy rivers and rock climbing walls. Like that was
mine
the reason.
Didn't. That would have been great.
Well, neither did mine, but some do. In fact, a lot do. But it turns out that's not really what's driving the cost. Once you divide the cost of that climbing wall by all 20,000 undergraduates and over the 10-year lifespan, it's not really a big deal. There's also a story out there that says that there's a huge administrative bloat happening on campuses. Sometimes that's connected to a pushback against the DEI efforts, diversity, equity, inclusion efforts that are happening on campuses, and saying we're building up too much infrastructure. The reality is that's probably not it either, and there are good reasons to be spending more on student support services. I really think the core issue is that cultural and political leaders have told Americans that having a college degree is part of the American dream. And so we have, to put it in bland economics terms, we've made the demand for higher education inelastic. People are willing to pay anything in order to get this degree. And so the institutions, the colleges and the universities, really have the power to set prices however they want. You then pair that with the subsidies that are available through the federal loan programs and the pretty unlimited lending that's available through the federal loan program, and you sort of enable that sort of inflation. So I think Pete Buttigieg's comment was really insightful, which is that we need to make it affordable to not go to college. We need to make it socially acceptable to not go to college so that colleges and universities don't have this monopoly on social mobility.
I wanted to dig into that a little bit because it sounds like if the message to the next generation is the path of upward mobility must go through a traditional four-year school, that's kind of the core driver of the problem. If everyone wants it, it becomes very expensive. There are many constraints on it as a good, as you've kind of talked about, and it's an expensive thing to get taught by a bunch of experts for 4 years. That's not a cheap proposition.
Right.
And if we can expand the meaning of what a path of upward mobility looks like, there are so many different options than traditional college where you can get really pretty good paying jobs that can provide for a family. And so I want to touch on that and then come back to the cost of college itself and maybe what should be done. But on this broader vision of upward mobility, what is the way to convince people of that? Saying that focusing on just a 4-year higher ed degree is too limiting for people who otherwise could take advantage of a lot of great options.
Well, I think two pieces. One is we need to celebrate other pathways to career outside of higher education, and we haven't seen that. Presidents in the State of the Union are always talking about goals of getting more and more people in and through college, and that's okay. And it's great that we're expanding access to this one path, but we should be celebrating other pathways too. And then the more practical side maybe is that we need to put money behind it. So we have a huge amount of subsidies that are going into traditional higher ed, meaning bachelor's, associates, graduate professional degrees. That's both through the explicit subsidies that students are getting and also through the idea of canceling student debt. I mean, that's a tremendous amount of money. If we thought about using that to put into apprenticeship programs or into other Department of Labor workforce development programs, that would show that we value those career pathways equal to education. And so I think we need to do that. I think that's an important step.
So I want to ask you this. Imagine Joe Biden, Kevin McCarthy, Chuck Schumer. They come into your office and they say, Dr. Akers, tell us what to do. We want people to be able to go to college. We want it to be affordable. We will do whatever you tell us.
This is sort of my dream scenario.
Right. Well, hopefully now it will happen. They're listening. Hey, that's a good idea. What do you tell them? Where do we start?
I really want policymakers to be thinking that the problem here to solve is risk. Right? We know that education pays, right? So I sort of dislike too much emphasis on the notion that it's too expensive, because sometimes it's too expensive, but a lot of times it's still a great deal. And so I want people to understand that. But I think the thing that policymakers need to dig into is the fact that sometimes you put out a lot of money, you spend a lot of time for a degree, either you don't finish or you do finish, but it doesn't lead anywhere. And then you've got a debt that you can't repay. That's a problem. And if we're leaning really heavily on education and student loans as a way to allow for social mobility, that's a problem that policymakers need to solve. And so I think what we need to do, instead of thinking about throwing money just generally at the problem through grants, through cancellation, is instead we think of nuanced ways of bailing out people who go through that process, who did the thing that we told them to do, go to college, make an investment in yourself. And when it doesn't work out, then we have relief available to them. So, but we're actually using that as a determinant of whether or not you're eligible for these taxpayer-funded resources.
So what would be the first step for that? I mean, everything you're saying makes sense, that we need to broaden the message of upward mobility. We need to not make it feel so centered on college. And it's something you said about risk. That are there ways that we can control for that risk or account for that so someone can still feel safe and, hey, I want to invest in a college degree. I believe in it. I believe it's something that will be beneficial. Personally, that was my circumstance. Have been very blessed from the higher education that I've been able to obtain. And so how can we, I guess, make college a little bit less risky and also broaden the pathways to the middle class?
Well, I think the first one's a little bit easier because we're actually a lot of the way there. We have a set of programs that are collectively called income-driven repayment. What they do is they lower monthly payments based on how much you're earning. So it's a fixed share of your income. It cannot exceed that level. And then if you don't succeed in paying back your loans in either 10 or 20 years, depending on the sector that you work in, your debt will be erased forever. And so that's actually a perfect mechanism for ensuring risk, basically taking away what a financier would call the downside risk of the situation. And that means that people who do succeed in borrowing and then earning their degree and going on to make a decent earnings, they do pay back their loans. So we rely on that system. It's a legitimate lending system, but we protect people on the bottom. And then in terms of broadening pathways to career, pathways for social mobility, I mean, I think it's a harder question because it takes a lot of different pieces. The thing I think about the most is the way that we talk about these things. And I'm very concerned about the fact that we don't celebrate other pathways to the same extent that we celebrate higher education. So I think that has to be part of the solution. I think there's also in the workforce development space, it's not as cohesive as higher education. So if a young person is thinking, do I want to go through a workforce development pathway or do I want to go to college? That's not really the way we see it. It's sort of like, well, my cousin was an apprentice with, this organization. And so that's maybe a pathway. And so I think there's a better organization that we could do on the workforce side so that young people can navigate those options just as efficiently as they can navigate higher education.
As we start to wrap up, I want to ask you, can you leave our listeners with, is there a single talking point, a cohesive message to equip them to say, we should maintain the separation of powers, going back to the court decision, that there's a better approach to this, but what is a message they can convey in their conversations with folks that you think moderates and persuadable voters would resonate with? So yeah, that does make sense. That is a better way.
Well, I hope they would embrace the ideas that I talked about, but something that I think that people could use in trying to communicate to others that disagree with them is to understand what the decision today really means. And I want to look back in time to when the Senate, the House, and the White House were all controlled by Democrats. At that time, student loan cancellation as a solution was a viable option through legislation, through the reconciliation process. Democrats did not vote for it because there was not unanimous support, even amongst Democrats, for this idea. And that's because people understand, our lawmakers understand that the amount of indebtedness that you have is not necessarily a good indication of the hardship you're experiencing. So just like those Democrats who didn't vote for it at that time realize we need to appreciate that this is a really nuanced issue that needs a really nuanced solution.
Well, Beth Akers, we want to thank you for your time and expertise. There will be ongoing discussions around this issue, of course. It is complex and important because it ties into upward mobility, something we care very much about here at Sutherland. Thank you again for joining us on Defending Ideas.
Thank you for having me.
We have one more break before we leave you with a couple final thoughts to help you in your conversations about the ideas we've been talking about today. I want to remind you to go to defendingideas.org. You can subscribe to this podcast, find shareable clips, as well as links to articles and deeper analysis about what we've been talking about today. You're listening to Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. Before we go, if you end up in a discussion with somebody about the Supreme Court overturning Biden's loan forgiveness plan, here are a few key points that you can use. Number one, center your position on the Constitution. The core question before the Supreme Court was about separation of powers, not the policy of loan forgiveness. The president, in this case, did not have the authority to do this. So if you're talking to somebody who actually loves this policy and thinks we should be expanding broad-based loan forgiveness, articulate that that kind of thing would have to be passed through Congress in order to be legal. The role of the court is not to be a policy-making body. The role of the court is to preserve the constitutional system. Second, you should clarify that you want college to be something that's a worthwhile investment, something that equips people to be able to provide for a family and pay off their debts. But articulate that there are better ways to accomplish that than broad, blanket loan forgiveness. For example, improving income-driven repayment and some of the other programs that already exist. Other solutions like this are best achieved through a deliberative policymaking process, which happens in Congress. We hope you enjoyed this episode and that you feel better equipped to defend the ideas we discussed today. If you enjoyed the episode, please visit defendingideas.org, where you can find shareable clips from today's episode, as well as subscribe to the podcast on any of the major podcast platforms. Thank you again for listening to Defending Ideas, where we are renewing the principles of common sense conservatism. From the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City, I'm Nick Dunn. We'll see you next time.